Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 2 for PC. This is a real-time strategy and real-time tactics game developed by Relic Entertainment and originally published under THQ in 2009, although Sega is now the one publishing it, since THQ shut down after all. And speaking of shutdowns, this thing uses Games for Windows Live, which means that will be shutting down in July as I'm making this video. And that's a problem, because it requires Games for Windows Live to actually work. You need it to save your game. You need it to play the multiplayer. And as far as I know, there aren't any patches forthcoming to actually remove Games for Windows Live from this thing. So, we may well be stuck with a completely unplayable Dawn of War 2. That's why I felt the urgency to actually get this review done before I review the original Dawn of War and its expansions. Because I can go back to those after the fact. But this one, if I don't do this before Games for Windows Live shuts down, it's not going to get reviewed. Most likely, anyway. So, the real question here is, since this was a radically different game from Dawn of War 1 and its many expansions, was that really a good thing? Did it really need the changes? And moreover, does the game benefit from all these changes? Or should it have stuck more with the style that Dawn of War had produced? Because, let's face it, Dawn of War was very well received and very widely loved. Whereas Dawn of War 2 caused a bit of an uproar when it came out. Not a huge uproar, but a bit of a dissonance in the fan base, so to speak. So, let's find out. Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, I do have to mention that one of the biggest changes between the original Dawn of War and this was the move to the Essence engine, which is what powered Company of Heroes. And this one is an updated version that has better DirectX 10 support and, of course, has more enhanced visuals and that sort of thing. But it also has the same core mechanics, which in themselves were pretty radically different from Dawn of War. So, right off the bat, you're getting a very different way of processing everything, and that's going to factor into the gameplay, and I will certainly mention that later on. That said, visually, this game does look better than Company of Heroes, and it certainly looks better than the original Dawn of War. Dawn of War looks dated, there's no getting around that. This doesn't look amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but it looks very, very solid by today's standards. And when it was released, it was one of the best looking real-time strategy, real-time tactics games out there. At least as far as the style goes. And of course, it has that very nice, gritty Warhammer 40,000 art style that Relic has really nailed. They've done a really good job with that across all of their titles. And this one is no exception. There is a surprising amount of color here. And after all the brown and gray and realistic titles out there, something like this is refreshing. So even though it is gritty and dark and grim, it still has this color about it. It still has this feel of fantasy. And that's something that Warhammer has always just done a really good job with. It's managed to have a very dark art style that has always managed to have this personality about it. That's, in addition to being grim dark, also rather fantastical, and you can't help but like it. And that's, of course, the case here. And it also really helps that you have all these subtle touches, like the very smooth animations for the most part, complete with just various maneuvers that they'll do when they're in the middle of combat. For instance, they'll gesture, or they'll look around, or they'll actually reload sometimes, and things like that actually give the game a lot of visual flair, and it makes things very nice to look at. Of course, the explosions are glorious, and the game is rather bloody. There are, in fact, kill moves in the game where you'll have guys go into these synchronized animations with an enemy and just annihilate them, and you get very nice large blood spatters and everything. So it certainly fits with the Warhammer 40k style. And the visuals certainly support that. It still looks pretty solid even today after all these years. So, when you get to the sound design, you find that things are even better, which is odd, but even though this thing has stood the test of time visually, it's certainly starting to look a bit dated, whereas with the sound, still top-notch. The music in particular is absolutely fantastic. It was done by Doyle W. Donahue, and the genre described in the soundtrack is pure epic. And that's pretty much exactly what it is. Just these massive orchestral sequences that are just really bombastic and powerful, and you just get this great sense of majesty and a grand scale. It's glorious. It fits Warhammer 40k perfectly. And of course, you just feel like a total badass when your Space Marines are slaughtering hordes of Tyranids to these grand orchestral scores. So that helps too. Then there's the voice acting, which is very Warhammer 40k-esque, complete with completely over the top, but still believable, oddly enough. Just phrases and such like that. Like the orcs, with their ridiculous accents and Modaka, and that sort of thing. Whereas the Space Marines are all gung-ho about the Emperor and how the Emperor protects and we are Space Marines and we shall annihilate the foe, and how the Eldar are all prissy and elegant and that sort of thing and look down upon everyone else. And then of course there's the Tyranids, which just kind of make snarling noises and such, but that's beside the point. And of course, in addition to the fantastic voice acting and music, you have really hard-hitting, powerful sound effects, where, for instance, bolters sound like friggin' hand cannons. They're awesome. And you're getting all these great sounds of warfare going on. They really did a phenomenal job with the presentation as a whole in this game, I really do have to say. I know I'm kind of dwelling on it, but the presentation in this game is top-notch. And they did an absolutely fantastic job of giving it that Warhammer 40k feel as far as its presentation goes. But obviously, as fantastic as the presentation is, it's not really what makes people so divided about the game. What really divides people is the gameplay, and actually not the story so much, but the story does play a part. And the way they've told it is kind of odd, particularly compared to the previous Dawn of War game. Dawn of War was a fairly traditional RTS. It certainly had the Relic style about it. It had a different way of getting resources and such like that. But it was still a base building RTS, and you had to build up units and actually use those units to your advantage and stuff like that. Well, the single player campaign in this is a real-time tactics game rather than a real-time strategy game. And it follows the story of the Force Commander that you create at the beginning of the game. He is a Blood Raven's Force Commander. And over time, he assembles his various troops. You have, of course, Avitus, the Devastator Marine, the Tactical Marine Squad led by Tarkus, the Assault Marine Squad led by Thaddeus, the Scout Marine Squad led by Cyrus, and then you have a Dreadnought. And, of course, the Dreadnought comes in later on and is ridiculous and everything. But you have up to 4 of these squads at any given time. And the basic story is you drop into Subsector Aurelia because it's the Blood Raven's main recruiting area, and you're trying to repel an orc invasion. Only it turns out that that wasn't really the primary threat. The primary threat was the Tyranids. And the idea was that the Eldar are stirring up the orcs to get them to fight against the Tyranids, because when they're fighting against the Tyranids, well, the Eldar don't have to deal with it, right? But it ends up being this kind of all-out war thing with the main story revolving around repelling the Tyranid invasion. If you're not sure what Tyranids are, and you're not sure what Space Marines or Eldar or the orcs are, well, I'm not going to go into Warhammer 40k's lore too much, but Space Marines are the genetically altered, or genetically engineered, I should say, soldiers of the Emperor of Mankind. They are supposed to be superhuman, the prime example of what it is to be a human and to serve mankind. They are clad in this incredibly tough power armor, they wield incredibly powerful weapons, and the idea is that they're basically walking tanks. They are ridiculously tough, and they are there to deal with any situation that the Imperial Guard, which is just the normal military for the Imperium, can't handle. And of course, they can't handle a Tyranid invasion, and they certainly can't handle an Orc invasion very well. The Eldar are basically elves, you can basically sum them up like that, and the Orcs are pretty much just what you would expect from Orcs, except that they're hilarious, and they did a really good job of making them hilarious in this game. And then the Tyranids you can basically think of as xenomorphs, only tougher and more ridiculous, and they devour worlds. So that's why this is a big deal. But that's really all you need to know about the story, just going into this thing. It does a decent job of filling you in if you haven't been familiar with Warhammer 40k lore. And for those of us who know more about the lore, we find that it's just not that great of a story. It does a decent job, but it's not really something that kept me interested throughout the game. And that was a big issue, because the story is something that it really tries to shove down your throat as far as the campaign goes. The gameplay in the campaign is real-time tactics. You have up to your 4 squads, and that's pretty much it. You can't call in other squads, you can't call in special reinforcements. All you can do is reinforce the squads you got if you're at a beacon, or just use your squads to their full advantage. And whenever your squad gets downed, any of the squads, the leader remains alive, you can revive him. Now, along the way, you will be leveling up your squads, and of course your force commander. And as you level up, you will get access to better and better abilities, like more accessory slots, or these special abilities that certain characters have, like Tarkus eventually gets the ability to fire plasma guns while moving. Really handy, because otherwise he has to stand still. It's kind of a problem. And things like that. And as you, of course, increase these skills, your Marines get better and better and better. And as you level up as well, you get access to better and better war gear, which is equipment. And these can range from different suits of power armor to Terminator armor, which is this super awesome power armor that allows you to have Terminator Marines. They're basically the super powerful melee combatants and the just the super heavy infantry, whereas the Space Marines themselves are just heavy infantry to begin with, basically. And access to weapons of different kinds. You'll get access to bolters, to plasma guns, to flamers, which are flamethrowers, power swords, thunder hammers, you name it. If it's in Warhammer 40k and the Space Marines use it, they're pretty much going to have it in here. And I found that the equipment mechanic wasn't really all that great, because it blocks things off to being based on levels. And frankly, some of the stuff you unlock just isn't any better than what you get earlier in the game. So you're not really given much of a choice here. It's, do you want this item that is better for this specific character, or do you want this thing that has just better armor rating, or what? And ultimately, I found that the equipment selection didn't really matter all that much. I was more relying on my squad's abilities than their martial prowess, so to speak, with just the plain weaponry. Although I'm sure the weaponry played a part, it really came more down to the tactics, to using cover, to actually getting, say, Avitus, the Devastator squad, into a building to seal off an area, or something like that. And that was something that I actually rather liked about the game. It feels more tactical than Dawn of War 1 did, in some ways. this increased reliance on cover, where your guys actually get very substantial defensive bonuses when they're in heavy cover versus light cover. And your guys actually move accordingly, and if they're in a firefight, they will actually move to cover. There's actually AI rendered on these characters, and they will pick their own targets and be able to take out enemies very efficiently. It does occasionally glitch up. You'll occasionally see guys running around like morons or getting caught between cover because they can't decide what they want to run to. And of course your guys will get stuck in suppression a lot of the time. So a lot of mechanics bleed over from the Company of Heroes. And they fit pretty well for the most part. And that's why I feel like the tactical approach rather than the more traditional RTS approach does work. The only real problems I have with it are in some of the mechanics just not feeling right, per se. Like the Eldar feel really underpowered when you actually get them into skirmish mode. They feel really weak. The Space Marines, of course, feel incredibly powerful, and obviously they are incredibly powerful, but the issues I have are kind of in the balancing side of things, and of course the occasional glitchiness of the AI. And really on the real-time strategy side of things. The campaign itself is not particularly great. It does vary missions up quite a bit, and you do get a selection of missions to choose from, and some of them are optional and have actual timelines you have to pay attention to. Like, there's only a certain amount of days that you can actually get those missions, and they have their own rewards, like certain types of war gear, or you succeed and you get to keep the foundry, or you get to keep the shrine to the emperor, or something like that. So they do vary things up quite a bit, and that tactical-minded gameplay really did make me enjoy it a fair amount. But I did find that toward the end of the campaign, it got really sluggish. And I think that was mostly because you're fighting Tyranids. Tyranids don't really do anything except rush. They are the Zerg of Warhammer 40k. In fact, the Zerg are pretty much directly ripped from the Tyranids. The Tyranids came before. So, that should sum that up pretty well. The campaign's okay. It's not the best campaign I've played, but that tactical-minded gameplay works out pretty well, and even though I found that the equipment and the leveling up was a bit lackluster, the abundance of abilities and the way that the squads actually work together, for instance, the suppression from the Devastator Marines and then the basically 1-2 punch that they have when you combine them with tactical Marines or assault Marines. Using melee troops to tear apart the ranged troops that are pinning down your guys, or using your ranged guys to take apart the melee guys before they get too close to you. Using your force commander as this just melee powerhouse, all that sort of thing, really worked rather well. But the campaign just wore on me. Which brings me to what the rest of the game has. Last Stand mode and Skirmish mode. Skirmish mode is a problem. It is either offline against AI, or online against other players or the AI. When you play against the AI, you find out very quickly that the AI in this game isn't very good. They don't really make good tactical decisions, they kind of run around like chickens with their heads cut off, and they're pretty much only good at actually taking out your troops. They're not really good at winning. So, it's really best played with other players. Now, that's a problem because Games Window's live. So I've never actually managed to play this thing online. I've managed to play Retribution online, which is Steamworks, but not based on War 2. So I can't really speak to that. I've also only played the Last Stand mode in Retribution, because again, Steamworks, it's a cooperative multiplayer mode where you play as a specific hero unit, like, say, a force commander. And you work together to fight off these hordes and hordes and hordes of enemies. Over time, your character will level up, you'll get access to new abilities and war gear and such like that. So, they decided to add in some RPG elements into these games, and with mixed success. Like I said, in the campaign it was rather lackluster. In Last Stand mode, it's more efficient because you're working with a single character as opposed to the squads that you were working with in the campaign. And the problem I have with Last Stand mode is it pretty much completely disregards what the strategy genre is all about. It's all about action in this particular mode, and it really just feels at odds with the whole game. And ultimately, I feel like that was my biggest problem with this game in general. It wasn't that the RPG mechanics in the campaign were just kind of lackluster, or that the campaign eventually wore on me because you're fighting Tyranids. Can't really help it if you're fighting Tyranids, I mean, come on. But it wasn't the spotty AI in skirmish mode or the games for Windows Live. It was that I felt like this game couldn't figure out what it wanted to be. At some points, it feels like it's trying to be an RTS, like in the skirmish mode, for instance. You don't build bases, but it still feels like it was trying to retain a lot of that Company of Heroes style of play, just without the base building. And it was with limited success. It does a decent job. It can be fun, but I feel like the skirmish mode is only really fun when you're playing it with friends or playing it online with really competent players. Because obviously, when you're playing against the AI, as you can see in the video, AI is not very good, so that doesn't really help. Last Stand mode just feels completely at odds with everything that both the campaign and the skirmish mode throw at you, so it feels like it was from a completely different game altogether. And then the campaign tries so hard to be a tactics game rather than a strategy game, and it all just feels like it's at odds with one another. It can't figure out what it wants to be. Is it a bad game? By no means. It's certainly solid. I just feel like it should have figured out what it wanted to be before they really released it. It was like they wanted to pull it in so many directions, and they decided, you know what? We're going to throw all of this into the game and just see where it goes from there. It met with limited success. Parts of the game are really fun. Parts of it, not so much. Parts of it work really well. The mechanics that it retained from Company of Heroes generally work pretty well. That engine is rather solid. It absolutely nails the Warhammer 40k feel. It does a good job of being a pretty solid tactics game. What it doesn't do a good job of is providing a very consistent and very enjoyable experience. It can be enjoyable, but only in certain spots. So it feels rather inconsistent throughout the entire game, and as a result, I wanted to give it higher, because I did enjoy it, but there's just so many issues with the way the game feels. It just, again, it can't figure out what it wants to be. So, ultimately, I'm only going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. Despite, at times, just feeling like it could have been so much more. And, well, maybe it did in the sequels. You never know. But, at any rate, again, 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.